Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us. When we usually talk about existential threats to humanity, the mind immediately goes straight to the cinematic stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like massive asteroid strikes or rogue AI taking over the global power grid.
Yeah, exactly. Or some catastrophic climate collapse where we're all just, left scavenging in the ruins of civilization. We just inherently assume that the thing that takes us down will be violently destructive.
Right, because the underlying assumption in all those classic dystopian scenarios is that the threat is overtly hostile to human life. I mean, we always measure the danger by the sheer scale of the physical destruction.
But the source document we are diving into today, it's this fascinating text titled afairworld.txt. It completely flips that entire script on its head.
It really does. It's such a wild perspective shift.
It is, because it doesn't ask if we can survive a meteor. It asks a far more unsettling question, like, could our current version of civilization actually survive a truly fair world?
And the author's conclusion is that, well, a fair world wouldn't destroy humanity at all. It would just force us to finally grow up.
Right, the real threat isn't to human survival. The threat is to the unfair advantages that we've built our entire identities and, frankly, our institutions around.
Yeah, this text basically takes a sledgehammer to some deeply ingrained economic and social structures. It's a really dense philosophical critique of how power actually operates globally.
Which is exactly why we need to state our mission for you clearly before we go any further. Because look, acknowledging that the source material touches on some very systemic, potentially politically charged themes, we want to assure you that our goal today isn't to take sides.
No, not at all. We aren't here to champion the author's politics or defend the current systems.
Right. We are here to act as architects, basically,
Yeah.
to stress test the blueprints of this hypothetical fair world and see if the underlying logic actually holds up. We're just serving as your objective guides, unpacking the arguments exactly as the author laid them out. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, to really understand the why and the how behind the author's claims, we have to start with how the text actually redefines the concept of fairness itself.
Because they don't mean the standard definition we all grew up with.
Exactly. The author is incredibly quick to dismiss what they call the kindergarten version of the word.
The kindergarten version being the idea that, everyone gets the exact same slice of cake.
Right, that forced equality of outcome.
Yeah, where individual effort doesn't even matter because the reward is just identical for everyone across the board.
And the author aggressively rejects that model. Instead, they define real fairness through absence.
Through absence, what does that mean exactly?
It means the complete absence of artificial barriers. So in this model, fairness is a world with no manufactured scarcity, no inherited structural advantages, no coercive institutions that just exist to extract value, and absolutely no systems rewarding dominance or gatekeeping.
Oh, wow. So it sounds almost like an extreme meritocracy, but without the invisible safety nets that usually protect the privileged from failure.
Exactly. It's a landscape where your life trajectory is dictated entirely by your choices and your effort, but it's backed by fully transparent access to human knowledge.
Which brings up the evolutionary biology angle the text takes, which I thought was super fascinating.
Oh, for sure. The author argues that humans are actually perfectly designed for this barrier-free environment.
Because if you look at most of our history as hunter-gatherers, we relied heavily on mutual aid, right?
Yeah, mutual aid, distributed problem-solving, egalitarian structures. I mean, we evolved for cooperation. We did not evolve for rigid extractive hierarchies.
So the core argument there is that fairness doesn't threaten our evolutionary traits. It actually taps into our baseline settings.
Precisely. The text mentions that removing these coercive systems would drastically reduce chronic stress, increase cognitive development, and even lengthen lifespans.
Just because people wouldn't be burning all their daily energy trying to defend themselves from institutional extraction.
Right. People would finally have the bandwidth to self-actualize. The constant fight-or-flight response triggered by, modern economic precarity would just disappear.
But wait, so if humans are naturally wired for this kind of cooperative baseline, why does the idea of fairness feel so unnatural and threatening to so many people?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, it's like playing a massive multiplayer video game where a small group of players doesn't just have higher level characters, they actually own the server itself.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
They've completely rewritten the code to make sure they always win. So real fairness in this context is really just resetting the server settings to default, right?
What's fascinating here is what happens when you hit that reset button. The players themselves are totally fine.
Right.
But the extractive systems that were built on those hacked rules, they completely crash.
They just evaporate.
Exactly. The text makes it very clear that fairness is not a threat to human nature at all. It is a lethal threat to institutional parasitism.
Let's look at that crash then, because the document provides a very specific list of what goes away if this server reset actually happens.
It does, and it's a pretty sweeping list.
We are talking about the total collapse of bureaucracies built entirely on gatekeeping.
Right. Take a system like pharmaceutical patent hoarding, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
You have this life-saving medical knowledge that already exists out in the world, but a massive bureaucracy is constructed purely to artificially restrict access to that knowledge.
Just to ensure it can only be obtained through a narrow, highly profitable bottleneck.
Exactly. So in a world defined by transparent access and zero artificial barriers, that entire corporate structure serves no actual function. It just dissolves.
The text also points to political systems built on manufactured conflict, right? And social hierarchies that depend completely on inherited advantage.
Yeah. Because if you strip away the ability to hoard opportunity and monopolize knowledge, those power structures simply have nothing left to stand on.
The author draws a really sharp, unforgiving line there, basically saying that power fears fairness because fairness removes the leverage of coercion.
You cannot force people to comply with an exploitative system if you do not control their access to basic survival needs.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit on behalf of the listener, because this is where the logic feels like it might hit a wall.
Go for it.
Aren't economies naturally built on scarcity? I mean, we can't magic away the laws of physics. There's only so much arable land on Earth. There's only so much fresh water, so much lithium.
Right, the physical limits of the planet.
Yeah. How does the author reconcile dissolving these economic systems without triggering just like total civilizational collapse?
So the text actually tackles that physical reality directly. It does this by separating natural limits from artificial scarcity.
Okay, how so?
Well, the author doesn't deny that finite resources exist. That would be absurd. What they are targeting is the deliberate hoarding and restriction of access designed purely to create artificial value.
Oh, I see. Like with food production.
Exactly. Think about global food production. We currently produce enough food to feed billions more people than actually exist on the planet right now.
Right, so the scarcity isn't a natural limit.
No, it's a distribution limit engineered to maintain price floors and profit margins.
Ah, so it's not that the river naturally ran dry. Is that someone built a massive dam, stopped the water from flowing to the village downstream, and is now selling that exact same water back to the villagers in little plastic bottles.
That is the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And the bureaucracy that manages those water sales, the security forces that guard the dam, the financial system that trades futures on the water prices, that entire ecosystem of manufactured unfairness is what the author says must evaporate.
But civilization itself doesn't end.
No. Civilization can reorganize itself into what the text calls a global optimum of autonomy. But that reorganization requires replacing extractive infrastructure with self-directed development and post-scarcity logistics.
So the infrastructure has to shift from extracting value to facilitating human autonomy. But if our current systems rely this heavily on coercion and manufactured scarcity, the text takes the logic to a very severe, very dark conclusion regarding the human cost of all this.
It really does. The argument moves firmly from just a systemic critique into a profound moral judgment. The text introduces this concept of economic war crimes.
Which is a massive escalation in language. I mean, the author does acknowledge that economic war crimes isn't a formal category recognized by The Hague or international law right now.
Right. There is no court prosecuting these specific structural actions today. However, the author argues the structural harm caused by these systems is morally and practically equivalent to crimes against humanity.
The mechanisms just look different.
Exactly. The weapons are financial levers rather than kinetic explosives. The battlefield is the global economy, and the casualties are often totally invisible.
But the preventable deaths, the collapsing life expectancies, the mass immiseration, they are just as lethal as a traditional war.
And to back up that heavy claim, the document lays out 5 very specific thresholds. It argues that when everyday systemic exploitation crosses these 5 lines, it enters the territory of undeniable moral responsibility.
Let's ground this so it doesn't just sound like a theoretical list.
Yeah.
Imagine a scenario where a private equity firm buys the only manufacturing plant for a cheap, generic, life-saving asthma medication.
Okay.
And upon buying it, they immediately hike the price by, say, 5,000%.
That scenario is the perfect test case for the text's framework. So if we apply the first threshold, which is intentionality, the board members making that pricing decision know exactly what they're doing.
Right, the price hike isn't some accidental glitch in an Excel spreadsheet. It is a deliberate, planned strategy.
Exactly. And they also know that a massive segment of patients will no longer be able to afford those inhalers, which hits the second threshold, foreseeability.
Because you don't need a crystal ball to know that making a life-saving drug totally unaffordable means a specific demographic of people will end up suffocating in emergency rooms. The outcome is entirely predictable.
Which brings us to the third threshold, scale.
Right. This isn't just one bad actor.
No, this isn't a single doctor overcharging one individual patient in an isolated incident. The action affects entire populations. It structurally alters the public health landscape of a country and devastates hundreds of thousands of lives.
And then there's the fourth threshold, which is preventability. In this asthma drug scenario, the private equity firm didn't hike the price because the raw chemicals suddenly became scarce.
No, not at all.
They didn't do it to save the company from bankruptcy. They did it purely because they had cornered the market and knew they could get away with it. The harm was completely avoidable without sacrificing anything essential to the business's actual survival.
And the final piece that locks this whole moral judgment in place is benefit extraction.
Right. They aren't just causing tangential harm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The perpetrators are directly profiting from the deprivation they engineered. The literal suffering of those asthma patients is the exact mechanism generating their profit.
Oh, wow.
So when those 5 thresholds align, intentionality, foreseeability, scale, preventability, and benefit extraction, the text argues you are no longer looking at market dynamics or standard unfairness. You are looking at engineered deprivation.
If the harm is that intentional and the consequences are that severe, it begs a massive psychological question.
It really does.
Like, how do the people running these systems sleep at night? Do the people sitting in that boardroom know they are meeting these 5 criteria?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text offers a really profound psychological insight here. The perpetrators of systemic harm rarely, if ever, see themselves as villains.
Because their worldview relies entirely on believing they are the protagonists of the story.
Yes, they genuinely believe their unearned advantage is just the natural order of the universe. They convince themselves they earn their position entirely through merit, intelligence, and hard work.
And the really dark flip side of that belief is that the victims must therefore be solely responsible for their own suffering.
Exactly. Because their baseline, their entire lived experience, is tilted so heavily in their favor, the mere concept of a level playing field feels actively hostile to them.
We see a mild version of this in everyday life all the time. Like, imagine a company that has provided free catered lunches for its executives for 10 years.
Okay, I can picture that.
And then suddenly, they stop the program to fund lower-level employee health care. The executives are furious. They feel like money was stolen directly out of their wallets, even though it was just an artificial perk being removed.
Right.
Now, scale that psychology up to fundamental human rights and massive economic advantages.
Scaling that up brings us to what I think is the most visceral and memorable image in the entire document, the platform analogy.
Yes, I wanted to talk about this.
The author writes that if you've been standing on a raised platform your whole life and that platform is gently removed, you feel like you've been violently pushed down.
You weren't pushed, though.
No. You were just standing higher than everyone else without realizing the platform was even there.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You can practically feel the drop in your stomach just thinking about that. To the person on the platform, gravity suddenly feels like a punishment.
Exactly. They experience the removal of their artificial boost as a direct, targeted attack. They experience baseline equality as persecution.
And because they feel attacked, they demand a justification for why this is happening to them. But the text identifies a massive logic gap here, right?
A huge one. The author argues that these individuals cannot actually reconstruct the logic of fairness. They simply cannot follow first principles, symmetry arguments, or basic reciprocity.
Because following that logic would require them to admit the platform existed in the first place.
Bingo.
It would mean acknowledging that their previous success wasn't 100% merit-based.
And that's a pill they refuse to swallow. To them, losing those invisible boosts, the fact that their preferences were always prioritized, or that they were structurally insulated from the consequences of their actions, losing that feels like a massive demotion and a profound sign of disrespect.
So they just reject the logic entirely.
The text makes a very stark claim here. These individuals don't actually want logic. They want the preservation of their advantage. If logic threatens that advantage, they will reject the logic, embrace victimhood, and insist the system is now heavily biased against them.
But if taking away this artificial platform feels like a violent demotion to those in power, how on earth do you implement these changes without triggering just an endless cycle of revenge?
That is a big question.
This leads to the final major theme of the document. We understand what fairness is, we see the war crime level harm of unfairness, and we know why the privileged feel victimized by equality. So how does the text propose we actually execute this server reset?
Well, the author unpacks this as a fundamental paradox of implementation.
Okay.
Yeah. To make the world fair, you absolutely must remove unfair advantages. There is no workaround. However, those losing their advantages will inevitably interpret that removal as persecution.
Because of the platform effect?
Exactly. They will demand a justification they are psychologically incapable of accepting. Therefore, fairness cannot be fully implemented without triggering defensive victimhood.
So you are going to get massive friction. It is structurally unavoidable, and you just cannot wait around for the people on the platform to agree that the platform should be dismantled, because they never, ever will.
Right, so the solution the text offers relies on drastically shifting our framing. We have to stop viewing the correction of these systems through the lens of retribution and start viewing it entirely through the lens of accountability.
Let's lay out that distinction because, those two words get thrown around interchangeably in political discourse all the time.
They do, but they are vastly different. Retribution is fundamentally backward-looking and emotional. It's about inflicting harm because harm was done to you.
It operates on the logic of, you deserve to suffer because you caused me to suffer.
Exactly. It requires a payoff of emotional vengeance. Accountability, conversely, is forward-looking and purely structural. It's about prevention.
So a fair system doesn't punish people for having past advantages.
No. It simply states you cannot continue to cause suffering, and the architecture of the system must be changed so you no longer possess the power to do so.
It's basically the difference between slashing the tires of a reckless driver out of anger versus a judge legally revoking their license.
That's a great example.
You aren't confiscating the keys to make them suffer or to get even. You are removing the keys so they physically cannot crash a car into a crowd of people ever again. You are removing the tool of harm.
This raises an important question, though, and the text is brutally honest about the reality of this approach. It admits that the reckless driver will almost always see losing their keys as an act of brutal, unjustified oppression.
Of course they will.
The friction is inevitable. But the author concludes that someone else's misinterpretation of reality doesn't make fairness an act of retribution. It simply makes fairness visible.
It simply makes fairness visible.
Wow, that is a powerful place to land. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today exploring a fairworld.txt.
We really have.
We started by tossing out the kindergarten idea of forced equality, redefining real fairness as the total absence of coercive, extractive barriers.
We examined how a truly fair world would trigger the collapse of bureaucracies built on gatekeeping, and how we must distinguish between natural physical limits and the manufactured scarcity used to control populations.
And we walked through the severe moral weight of these systems, applying the 5 thresholds: intentionality, foreseeability, scale, preventability, and benefit extraction to see exactly when systemic exploitation becomes indistinguishable from an economic war crime.
Then we climbed onto the metaphorical platform to understand the psychology of privilege, exploring the logic gap that makes losing an unearned advantage feel like a violent push downward. And finally, we unpacked the structural paradox of implementation, highlighting the critical difference between seeking emotional retribution and demanding systemic accountability. So what does this all mean for you?
Yeah, how do we apply this?
How do you take a dense theoretical text like this and apply it to your daily life? I think the immediate application is a radical change in perspective.
I agree.
The next time you encounter a headline, a corporate press release, or even a colleague claiming that a new policy or a cultural shift is deeply unfair to them, ask yourself a question based on today's deep dive. Are they actually being harmed? Are their basic human needs being threatened? Or is their invisible platform just being gently lowered to the ground?
It is such a vital, critical lens to carry forward. But to leave you with a final thought to mull over, let's look past the immediate implementation.
Okay, where does this go next?
Well, the source material deeply explores the shock and the defensive victimhood of those who have their platform removed today. But consider the long game. What happens a generation after the platform is gone?
Oh, that's interesting.
When an entirely new generation is born and raised on transparent access, mutual aid, and true baseline autonomy, does the psychological memory of that old entitlement fade away completely? Or does human nature dictate that the desire for an unfair advantage will slowly creep back in?
Right, like will they try to rebuild it?
Exactly. Will it become a new myth they try to recreate, a new server setting they quietly try to hack? It's something to watch for in the systems around us,
Yeah.
and inevitably in ourselves.
Will we always try to build a new platform, even in a fair world? That is an incredible question to leave off on. As always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your curiosity and your willingness to step into these complex, structurally challenging perspectives is what makes doing this show so rewarding. Until next time, keep questioning the architecture of the systems around you, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.